There are some people who seem too grounded to simply vanish. People whose lives are woven so deeply into purpose, into community, into something far bigger than themselves, that the thought of them being gone feels almost impossible to sit with. Nancy Guthrie was one of those people. She had built something real, something that genuinely mattered. Her name carried weight in the spaces where grief and faith quietly intersect, in the rooms where people go when life has handed them something too heavy to hold alone. For years, she was a steady presence, a calm voice at the center of storms that most of us will never have to imagine surviving, and then the silence started, not suddenly, not all at once. It crept in the way silence always does when something is wrong, slowly, almost gently, until you look around one day and realize the noise you depended on is simply gone. People began to notice. The updates thinned, the appearances stopped. The rhythm of her presence online, in public, in every space she had always reliably shown up in, went completely quiet. And when people reached out, when they asked questions, the answers that came back were vague, incomplete, the kind of answers that open more doors than they close. So what actually happened to Nancy Guthrie? Is she okay? Is she still here? Is there something still unfolding beneath the surface of what anyone publicly knows? Because the closer you look at this story, the more unsettling the picture becomes. Stay with this, because this is not a simple story. To understand why her silence feels so significant, you first have to understand who she actually is. Not just her name, not just the titles attached to it. You have to understand what she came to represent for the people who found her at the very bottom of their lives. Nancy Guthrie is a speaker, an author, and a grief companion. That's the shortest way to describe it. But that description barely scratches the surface of what she actually does, or what she has had to endure in order to do it. She and her husband David lost two children, not one, two. Both children were born with a rare and devastating metabolic disorder called Zellweger syndrome, a condition that quietly dismantles the development of the brain and nervous system and offers no path to survival. Their daughter Hope lived for 199 days. Their son Gabriel lived for 183 days. And when that was over, when the silence of that particular kind fell over their home, Nancy didn't disappear into it. She didn't close the door and go dark. She did something that most people in her position would never have had the strength to do. She turned the deepest pain imaginable into a lantern for others still walking in the dark. She wrote books about grief that didn't reach for easy answers. She led Bible studies. She organized retreats, specifically and carefully designed for parents who had lost children, who had nowhere else to go where someone truly understood. She became, in the most genuine sense of the word, someone who could sit inside suffering with others, because she had already lived there herself. She knew what it felt like to hold a child and understand that time was almost gone. She knew what came after. And the people who were carrying that same impossible weight found her, and they found something real. For years, she showed up consistently, intentionally, and with a kind of personal honesty that made her unmistakable. She wasn't performing. Anyone who encountered her work understood that immediately. What she said and wrote carried the specific gravity of someone who had actually been through what she was describing, not someone approximating it from the outside. Her following grew. Her reach expanded, speaking engagements, podcasts, major events, theological conferences. She stood on stages and spoke to thousands of people about suffering, about hope, about what it means to keep moving when everything inside you wants to stop. And through all of it, she remained remarkably steady, not untouched by pain, not immune to it, but not undone by it either. There was a quiet, difficult-to-name strength in her that people noticed and remarked on constantly, which is exactly what makes the shift when it came so striking, because something changed. And the people who had followed her for years, who had leaned on her voice during the hardest seasons of their own lives, started to feel it before they could put words to it. The presence faded. The updates slowed, the rhythm that had always been there quietly broke, and questions began to rise. For a long time, things looked the way they had always looked. Nancy and David had built a life and a ministry together that was, in many ways, genuinely unusual. Most people who survive the kind of loss they survived eventually retreat from public life or rebuild something entirely separate from the grief. Nancy did neither. She built directly on top of it. She made the loss the very foundation. The respite retreats they created became known in certain communities as something almost rare. A protected space for bereaved parents that didn't try to fix anything, didn't push toward resolution, didn't offer easy theology dressed up as comfort and call it enough. People who attended those retreats came back different, not because everything had been resolved, but because, for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel utterly alone in what they were carrying. Her books found people in hospital rooms in the weeks after funerals, in the quiet and crushing hours of the night when grief pays no attention to the clock. Readers wrote to her. They told her that her words had held them together when they were on the edge of falling completely apart. That her willingness to speak honestly about darkness had somehow brought them back toward something resembling light. She wasn't just known, she was trusted. And that kind of trust is not built quickly. It accumulates over years of showing up and telling the truth. Her schedule reflected someone in full motion. Conferences, speaking engagements, podcast appearances, writing projects, ongoing ministry work. She was not slowing down, she was not looking toward an exit. And the people around her, the audiences, the readers, the retreat attendees, saw someone who had arrived at a kind of hard-won peace. She spoke about her children with a grief that was present but no longer raw in the early, breathless way that fresh grief is raw. It had been lived with. Carried long enough that she could hold it steadily and still hold other things alongside it. To outside eyes, Nancy Guthrie was a woman at the full height of her calling. That was the picture. That was what the world saw. But pictures and reality are not always the same thing, and sometimes the most important things are the ones that aren't being said at all. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment things shifted. That's almost always how it works. There's rarely a clean line you can draw and say, here, this is where it changed. It happens the way a tide quietly pulls back, gradually, almost invisibly, until you finally look up and the shoreline is unrecognizable. People who followed Nancy's work closely began to notice an absence they couldn't fully name. Posts that had arrived with regularity became sparse. Events she would naturally have been part of passed without any mention of her name. Updates that had once flowed steadily through her platforms grew infrequent, then rare, then nearly invisible. For a while, the explanations people reached for were reasonable ones. Everyone needs to step back at some point. Everyone deserves rest. Someone who had given as much as she had, who had carried the weight she had carried for as long as she had carried it, surely had the right to go quiet for a season. People assumed she was recharging, living privately for a while, taking the space she had earned, but the silence kept stretching. And the tone of what little communication did surface began to feel different, not in a dramatic, immediately alarming way, but different enough that the people who knew her work most deeply, who could sense the subtle shifts in how she expressed herself, started to carry a quiet, unspoken concern. There were mentions of health, nothing detailed, nothing explicit, but enough to suggest that something physical was happening, something significant enough to affect her capacity to maintain the pace she had kept for so long. According to reports and communications from those close to her situation, Nancy had been navigating a serious health challenge. The specifics remained private. That was entirely her right. She had never been someone who put her pain on display for effect. Even in her most personal writing, difficult material was handled with care and restraint, never used for emotional leverage. But the absence of clarity, sitting alongside the silence, made the concern harder to push aside. Not because people felt entitled to know everything about her life, but because someone who had always been so consistently present had become someone you could no longer locate. And that particular kind of disappearance has a weight all its own. When someone who has spent their entire public life speaking about suffering begins to suffer privately, the texture of that story is different from other stories. The people watching aren't simply curious outsiders. They're individuals who leaned on her voice through their own unbearable seasons. People who carry a real lived connection to her that was never about celebrity or fame. It was about survival. It was about holding on. And so when the sense began spreading that something was genuinely wrong, the concern that rose in those communities wasn't the kind that follows a public figure from a distance. It was something more intimate than that. It was the particular ache of worrying about someone who, without ever sitting across a table from you, had somehow sat with you in your darkest hours. That dynamic is worth pausing on, because it shapes everything about how this story lands. The reports that began to surface, cautiously and without much specific detail, suggested that what Nancy was facing was not a brief or passing difficulty. Not something that would resolve in a few weeks and allow her to return to her previous rhythm. According to people connected to her ministry and others in close contact with her community, there was a quiet acknowledgement that Nancy was not well. That she was navigating a period of genuine personal difficulty that reached beyond anything she had previously carried publicly. And this is where the story goes somewhere deeper. Because Nancy Guthrie, of all people, understood suffering with a precision that most human beings never develop. She had written about it with more care and nuance than almost anyone. She had walked alongside others through it with a grace that was hard to watch without being moved. But facing it again, in this form, in her own body this time rather than in the grief of losing someone else, that is a different interior journey entirely. People who spend years helping others find their way through pain do not automatically find their own pain easier to bear. In many ways, the opposite is true. Because they understand clearly what they are facing, there is no cushion of ignorance, no distance, just the full, unfiltered weight of it met directly. The people who cared about Nancy were watching someone they loved walk a road she had spent years helping others survive. And there was something in that, something deeply moving and deeply hard, that words don't quite reach. When a person who has built their entire life around the meaning found inside suffering is then asked to face a new chapter of suffering themselves, questions arise that are not comfortable to sit with. People who had found something to hold onto through Nancy's writing, who had rebuilt pieces of themselves partly because of her steadiness, began to ask quietly what this meant. Not as a theological debate, not with anger, just with the quiet, frightened honesty of someone who has placed real weight on something and is now watching it tremble. If someone who had already endured so much was now facing this, what did that say about the safety of anything? That might sound like a selfish question to some. It isn't. It's what happens when a person has become a genuine source of strength for others. Their vulnerability becomes a kind of mirror. It reflects back the fragility that everyone, on some level, already knows is there, but tries not to look at directly. And that is never a comfortable reflection. But beyond the interior questions, more practical concerns were surfacing too. Questions were being raised, according to those following the situation closely, about the future of everything she had built: the retreats, the ministry, the ongoing support structures for bereaved parents that had quietly operated under her vision and guidance for so many years. What happens to something like that when the person who built it can no longer carry it the way they once did? It isn't a simple question. Those retreats were not just scheduled events. They were lifelines, the kind of infrastructure that is genuinely rare, that takes years to construct, and that cannot simply be handed off or replicated overnight. And behind that structural question was the more human one, the one that was harder to articulate and harder still to answer. What was Nancy going through, privately, in the space away from the stages and the books and the public presence? What does a woman who has spent decades helping others navigate grief feel when grief, in a new shape, comes back for her? No official conclusion has been reached. No complete public statement has been made that puts the open questions to rest. What is known remains incomplete, pieced together from second-hand accounts and carefully limited disclosures. But what is clear is that something real is happening. And the people who love her, whether through years of personal friendship or through a single book read alone in the middle of a sleepless night, are holding that reality with a quiet and serious kind of care that speaks volumes about who she has been to them. As of the most current available information, Nancy Guthrie's situation remains, in many important ways, unresolved. There has been no dramatic turn. No public statement that closes every open question and returns things to clarity. What there has been, according to various accounts from within her community, is something quieter but no less significant. There is evidence of love surrounding her. Evidence of people showing up for her the way she spent her entire life showing up for others. And if that is true, there is something quietly profound in it. The woman who made her life's work the act of sitting with the grieving, now being held by people she helped find their footing. A kind of full circle that carries its own particular weight. But the uncertainty remains. Her health trajectory is not publicly known. The extent of what she is navigating has not been disclosed, and that is entirely as it should be. The questions raised by her extended absence remain largely unanswered. And for the people who rely on her ministry, who have built their plans around the retreats and resources she created, the future holds an uncertainty that is genuinely difficult to live inside. There is also something more complex happening in the broader community around her, something psychological, something that doesn't get talked about often. The people who found hope through the story of her losses are now confronted with the possibility that her story may be moving into another chapter of suffering. And they are having to sit inside that without information, without resolution, in the same suspended uncertainty that grief itself so often creates. That is not easy. It's a specific kind of waiting. The kind where there is nothing you can do, nothing to fix, nothing to push. All you can do is hold what you're feeling and keep hoping. And perhaps, in a way that feels both unexpected and entirely fitting, that is exactly the place Nancy always prepared her readers to inhabit. She never promised that life would eventually run out of hard things to deliver. She only ever said that hard things could be survived. That meaning didn't evaporate just because circumstances became unbearable. What is happening now is being held by thousands of people who want her to be okay. Not as a public figure who belongs to them in some way, but as someone who changed something real and permanent inside of them. Someone who gave them something to hold when they had run completely out of their own strength. And that kind of love, widespread and quiet and completely sincere, is its own testament to what she built. There is a particular kind of person who doesn't choose their calling so much as discover it inside the wreckage of something they never wanted to survive. Nancy Guthrie is that kind of person. She didn't set out to become a voice for the grieving. She set out to live an ordinary life, to love her children, to build something good and lasting. And when that was interrupted in the most devastating way possible, when hope came and left, when Gabriel came and left, she could have gone silent. She could have retreated into the kind of private grief that no one would have questioned or blamed her for choosing. She didn't. What she built instead required a sustained and particular kind of courage, not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself, the quiet, daily kind. The kind that shows up again and again, that keeps speaking honestly, that refuses to pretend that pain is smaller than it is or that it resolves more neatly than it does. In a world that consistently asks suffering to stay out of sight, she made space for it. That was her work, that was her gift. The questions surrounding her now are real, the concern is real. The silence is real, but so is what she left in the world. And that is not a fragile thing, it lives in the people she helped reach the other side of something unlivable. In the parents who sat in those retreats and found, for the first time in a long time, that they could breathe again. In the readers who opened her books in the worst hours of the worst nights, and discovered that someone else had been in that exact darkness and had kept going anyway. In the thousands of quiet acts of courage performed by ordinary people who faced unimaginable loss and found, in her voice, a reason to stay. Whatever is happening with Nancy Guthrie right now, whatever this chapter holds, it is being carried by someone who has already shown the world, more than once, what the human spirit is capable of enduring. That doesn't make the concern any lighter. It doesn't make the silence easier to sit with, but it means that her story, whatever comes next, is not the story of a person broken by suffering. It is the story of someone who chose, again and again and again, to let suffering mean something. That choice doesn't disappear when a voice goes quiet. It stays. It lives in other people. It keeps moving forward, even when the person who first made it cannot. We don't have all the answers yet. We may not for some time. But what we do have is the certainty that she mattered. That she matters still. And that the people she found at their worst moments are now, in their own quiet ways, holding her at hers. That is not a small thing, that is everything. If this story stayed with you, if something in it landed somewhere real, you don't have to rush past it. Take a moment with it. Think about what it actually means to build something meaningful out of the hardest experience of your life. Think about the people in your own world who have been that steady, quiet presence when you needed one most. If Nancy Guthrie's work has ever touched your life, or if something in this story brought up something you're still carrying, leave a comment below. We read all of them. And if you want more stories told this way, with care, with honesty, with room for everything that doesn't wrap up neatly, subscribe and stay close. There is more to come.